Hey, welcome back. I'm JW. Today, I want to talk about language. A lot of the questions that I got asked when I told people I was moving to Europe were about language. What language do they speak over there? Do they speak English? Do you know the language? Are you gonna have to learn the language? That kind of stuff. So I want to talk a little bit about that. Now that I've been in Europe for just about 6 weeks now, I may have some more concrete answers as to how that works and how language has affected me as an American moving here to Europe. Just so we're on the same page here, I've only ever been a fluent speaker of one language, which is of course English. And that is very, very common for the majority of Americans, especially where I come from, semi-rural Kentucky. People generally only speak English. Growing up, I knew, like, some people in my family had maybe learned a little bit of Spanish, or like my sister took French in school, and I knew other people in my community that maybe spoke other languages. In high school, I had one friend who was trilingual, and that was exceptional to me because that was such a rarity where I come from. But even in high school, I was already interested in other cultures, other languages, other countries. So I started learning some German in high school, and that continued on and off for several years. I took a couple semesters of German in college, and the timing worked out well that I had taken what is essentially the third semester of German conversational language right before I spent 6 weeks studying abroad in Austria, which is a German-speaking country. So I was living in Salzburg for a music program for that part of that summer, but I was able to actually use some of the German that I learned in courses. After that time, again, it's been sort of on and off. I've learned a little bit of German, but then never had the opportunity to use it in America. I have some level of understanding, but definitely not fluent in German. But that's the closest I have ever been to knowing a second language. Most recently, last summer, when I was traveling through Austria and Germany and northern Italy, I was able to use that German a little bit again. Still only the basics, asking people how they're doing, ordering food, stuff like that. Just enough to get around without always having to resort to English. And some of the places that I went, especially when I was in the Dolomites in northern Italy, in this region called Südtirol, which is historically more German-speaking and not Italian, there were towns where people I had to interact with, because it was at the place I was staying or ordering food, they spoke German and they really didn't speak English. So I had to use that language, and I knew enough to help me out. Fast forward back to the now, I have moved to Estonia in northeastern Europe, a Baltic state, and the language is very interesting. A lot of people in America before I moved really didn't even know about the country at all, let alone the language and how any of that worked. I'll try and give you a very brief history. Most of the languages in Europe come from common ancestors, and those languages split at some point, within the last few thousands of years, but they've split multiple times. So people are familiar with some of the main language branches, like the Italic branch, all the Latin languages, right? Italian, French, Spanish, Portuguese, Romanian, etc. The second largest branch, or maybe the largest, they're probably pretty close, is the Germanic tree. So pretty much all Northern European languages, which includes German and Dutch, and also the Scandinavian languages. All of the Old Norse Viking languages come from that Germanic branch, as well as English, which has more of that Germanic and Norse influence in its structure, the grammar especially. Although, of course, we have a language that's been influenced a lot by French and some Greek and many other things, making it a very complicated, bastard child of languages, essentially. After Italic and Germanic, I think the next largest language tree branch would be the Slavic languages. So of course, Russian is a very largely spoken language in the world, but most of the other Eastern European languages also come from that branch. Lithuanian and Latvian are actually the oldest versions in that language tree. And they don't use the Cyrillic alphabet that you've seen that the Russian language uses, but other languages, Ukrainian and others, are a little closer to Russian. There are a couple other branches in Europe for languages, like the Celtic branch, which there's still some existing, like Celtic Irish and Scottish Gaelic. There are, of course, some other outliers, some regions in the Balkans, for instance, there are other language branches. There are a couple random outsiders like the Basque language in a very specific portion of Spain that basically has no related language and no common ancestor. It's really a mystery where that has come from. That's by far an exception though. In the midst of all that though, there's this other smaller language branch called Uralic, or like Finno-Ugric. I didn't do my preliminary research to remember the exact order of this language branch, but there's this set of languages that comes back way farther than actually Germanic or Slavic, any of the languages that surround these regions. Farther back in this tree is Hungarian, which again, surrounded by mostly Slavic and Germanic languages. And then a little closer in history, this language tree turned into what is now Estonian and Finnish. So Estonian and Finnish are fairly closely related languages, but aside from that, Hungarian is pretty far away, and this whole branch has nothing in common with the Slavic or Germanic languages. There are a few other existing languages in this branch. They mostly belong to these Uralic tribes of northern Russia. Think essentially the people that were in this region of far northeastern Europe and northern Russia before any of the Slavic languages even got there, or any of the Germanic languages, in the Scandinavian region. So that, to me, is all very interesting. It might be super boring to you, but I love history and etymology and linguistics and the history of all of that. So this language, Estonian, is the main language, obviously, of the country Estonia, where I'm living now. And it's a language that's not similar at all to any of the languages that I've spent time with in the past. Learning a bit of German, I took a couple semesters of French, and of course learned some basics in Spanish just because that's the only language that is somewhat used in America regularly, aside from English. Estonian is totally different, but I did spend a little bit of time before I visited here last year and while I was here learning the basics, and that's mostly just greetings and thank you and numbers, stuff like that. So between that time and me moving here, I did put in a little bit of work to familiarize myself with the language a little more, but I definitely didn't learn very much before moving. Now that I'm here, I have a better grasp of how much I need to learn that language. I have an idea of maybe how much work I want to put into the Estonian language. And it's important to note that the capital city of Estonia, here in Tallinn, is by far the largest city. Tallinn is a sort of hub for international business, especially in like the tech startup field in Europe. It's also a pretty touristy destination because it's this beautiful medieval town. It's also right on the Baltic Sea, so you get a lot of ferry traffic from Helsinki and Stockholm. You also get cruise ships in the Baltic Sea. So because of this international business and tourism industry, there's a lot of English. English being the most commonly spoken language. Essentially, that's the language that people go to as the common language. If you don't speak each other's languages, you might both be able to speak some English. Of course, as a result of colonialism and domination in certain markets and business, especially like media and entertainment, English has become, that language that people are more likely to know. Here in Tallinn, and this doesn't apply to the rest of the country necessarily, but in Tallinn, a lot of people do know English, especially those people who have been raised since the collapse of the Soviet Union in the last 30 odd years. They've grown up in a country that has taught some English. So I've realized in being here that it's really easy to just use English and get around just fine in most of the city. Enough of the people that I interact with in social settings, and especially in customer service, mostly in restaurants, but also in stores where you don't necessarily need much language to interact with people, English is plenty to get by with. I've actually made friends here who are expats that have lived here for years, and they've never really taken the time or effort to learn Estonian because they really haven't needed to. And there is an argument to be made that if you're living in another country, maybe you should learn, some extent of that language. It's one thing to think that in a country like America, where that everyone basically only speaks English and a foreigner is going to need English to get by. But it's a different thing when you're in a country with only, 1.5 million speakers of that language. There's only 2 million worldwide. It's just not a widely used enough language to become that necessary when English is also commonly used here. I have had interactions with people who didn't speak English. I've asked people in Estonian if they did, and they said no. I've also interacted with plenty of Russian speakers who don't speak English, and they might speak a little Estonian, but we were unable to communicate because I definitely don't know any Russian. But if it weren't for my job, which is with an Estonian choir, it is directed in Estonian, and almost everyone in the choir interacts with each other in Estonian. That's really the only push that I have to learn more Estonian. So I get by fine singing in this professional choir, even though they're using Estonian. I can pick up well on context and use my musical skills to still perform adequately without always knowing exactly what they're saying for us to do. And through that job, I have at least regular exposure to the Estonian language. And in addition to that, I am now taking lessons with an Estonian tutor so that I can learn the grammar and learn better pronunciation and actually learn a bit of Estonian. I don't think that I will ever become fluent because it is a pretty difficult language. And again, it's not a language that you need to travel much or to use in other places. Travel is a big motivator for people to learn other languages. I've noticed that especially here, when people learn languages that aren't the locally used, Estonian, Russian, or English, they're learning a language so that they can travel to other places and communicate in that native language. So German, Spanish, French, whatever. There are many reasons to want to learn these languages that are so largely spoken and spoken in multiple countries across the world, but Estonian is basically only spoken in this small country of Estonia. So I do want to learn a bit of the language because I'm living here, and I don't want to come across as an American who lives here but just totally doesn't care about at least trying to learn the language. But I'm also being realistic and thinking that no matter how long I end up living here in this country, Estonian isn't a language that would necessarily be worth the amount of time and effort that I would have to put into becoming fluent. I will continue learning Estonian, but not to the point of fluency, and we'll see where that gets me. Being an American and an English speaker makes me feel at some kind of disadvantage here, not here like just in Tallinn, Estonia, but in Europe overall. Basically, every person I come into contact with is multilingual, at least speaking 2 languages, and a lot of people I've met speak 3 or 4 languages, like fluently, basically. And that is so common over here. And it really puts things into perspective that Americans and other English speakers have this privilege, and I think we really take it for granted that English is the only language that we need. And for most people, if you don't travel much, then you can go through your life without needing another one of those languages. It makes traveling so much easier sometimes and more fulfilling, and it can really help you appreciate other cultures and other places more if you understand another language or some level of another language. I've experienced that, to that extent that I've been able to use the German language in those countries. And of course, as I learn Estonian, I'm starting to pick up more things out and about in the city. And I really wish that in America, they put more emphasis on people learning other languages, especially if you have a desire to travel and interact with people that speak those other languages. It is scientifically much more difficult to learn a new language as an adult, having never learned a language before, than it is as a child, when you have a much higher level of neuroplasticity. So essentially your ability to learn new things and to retain that information is like several times easier as a young child, and still to an extent as a teenager, but that's sort of when it starts to fade a little bit in teenage years up until early 20s. I'm glad that I have learned a little bit of German and took a little French, and it helps that I've learned how to pronounce many languages to sing them as a classical singer. But Estonian would be so much easier if I learned more languages before, especially as a child. I think our world has become so globalized, so international. It is continuing to become even more so, that you are automatically at an advantage if you speak another language and have that ability to interact with people and travel to more places with, easier ability to communicate. Maybe I'll come back to this topic in the future and let you know, if I've learned more Estonian, if I'm working on any other languages. But for now, Tallinn, Estonia is a place where you can use English very easily, and you don't necessarily have to learn the language. I'm getting by just fine, but I'm also missing out on a lot because so many people around me are speaking these other languages, and I just don't know what they're saying. It definitely changes your perspective. Let me know if you have any questions on this topic. Again, at this point of recording, I've only lived in Europe, in Estonia, for like 6 weeks, 7 weeks, somewhere around there. So I'm definitely still adjusting, but I'm getting to know the language and the culture, and it's only going to get better from here. So, thanks for watching.